A history telling the story of icons usually has a focus on when and where famous icons were painted. We learn about the icons and also something of the development of the place of icons in the politics of the church. In this regard, we learn of the iconoclastic period and the divergence of artistic styles, especially between East and West influences. Well, by contrast, I have found myself exploring a timeline that looks at the events and saints that have become the subjects of icon art. I have refrained from going back into the Hebrew scriptures except to note that the most famous icon, that of Rublev's Trinity, depicts the three messengers who visited Abraham and Sarah. It takes us back thousands of years before the Common Era. Not as far as Noah or Adam and Eve, but a long way back. For the most part, the icons you see are mine. It'd be obvious which ones aren't. I don't do any stone carving, that's for starters. Well, so, starting with the Gabriel visiting Mary icon, Gabriel announcing to Mary the imminent birth of Jesus and the incarnation. The date line suggests Jesus was born before the year 0 because Luke's account of the birth identifies historical dates that look more like about 4 years before the Common Era. Yes, weird, I know, but that's how the historians have looked at it. A clearer date is the date of the death of Jesus and the resurrection and Pentecost. We get some idea of the effect of the life of the followers of Jesus when the first martyr, Stephen, was killed in Jerusalem. There he was observed by Saul, later to be known as Paul, whose conversion is reported to be soon after. The mission outreach, particularly the conversion of the Gentiles, required decisions by the church leaders back in Jerusalem. No, that's not one of my icons. The spread of the gospel is moving west and east very quickly, but the new religion is making big waves requiring political intervention in Rome. No, I did not carve Nero's bust. And the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in Rome. A pivotal event in Jewish and Christian history is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era. There is evidence that John's Gospel was written after the destruction of Jerusalem. Through the 2nd century, there are influential writers such as Irenaeus. They're not such popular saints for modern icon painters. The next important date for the church is the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. Christianity is no longer illegal. Constantine's mother, Helena, was a pivotal player in this event. She was a Christian. 4th century produced giants of faith. Macrina was an influential sister of Gregory and Basil, who established one of the early monasteries. Another huge influence was Augustine of Hippo, baptized in Milan by Ambrose. Again, there was a mother's influence, the mother Monica. British icon painters, both Orthodox and Western, have a lively interest in Celtic and Anglo saints. The first of these was Patrick. Meanwhile, John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, died in exile. He and Basil the Great often appear on the centre doors of iconostases. Augustine died in 430, and everything that has happened in the church has occurred during the Roman Empire. But significantly, the Byzantine Empire continued after the end of the Roman Empire, and it continued with strength through the Middle Ages of Europe. Benedict of Nursia had a significant influence on the monastic life. These were centres for missions to unchurched lands and tribes, and he wrote significant rules for the conduct of monastic life. The 6th and 7th centuries saw missions extending into Britain. Columba from Ireland established his community on Iona, off the coast of Scotland. Augustine, a Benedictine monk, was sent by Gregory I to England, and he is the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Again, no, I didn't paint this icon. Meanwhile, the Celtic missions were moving through Scotland and Northumbria with Aidan and a favourite of mine, Cuthbert, who succeeded Aidan. The clash between Rome and the Celts came to a head at the Synod of Whitby, hosted by Hilda. Rome's influence and rule prevailed. We know much of this history through the writings of the Venerable Bede, but notice how late after the events he was writing. A pivotal point in the history of iconography is the iconoclastic period. Mosaics, such as those in Ravenna, survived this atrocity. Difficult to destroy mosaics. A hero for icons was John of Damascus, whose arguments greatly influenced the decisions of the Second Council of Nicaea that restored icons and laid down some clear guidelines for their painting. Iconoclasts still persisted in their attacks. They were finally silenced, and in this silencing it is celebrated and still celebrated today as the triumph of orthodoxy. The mission of Cyril and Methodius, whose methods differed from those of Rome, who insisted on Latin as the Church's teaching and liturgical language. Note that Jerome had already translated the Bible into Latin 400 years earlier, so Latin liturgy was alive and well. But in the East, it was Greek. Prince Vladimir of Kiev brought final conversion to Orthodoxy in the Russians, and this icon by Philip Davidov was painted as an affirmation of Ukrainians in their resistance to Russia's war against them. It's an example of how icons of past saints and events speak to current events. The next pivotal date is the great schism between the Eastern and Western churches. From this time on, a distinction is required for identifying saints as belonging to the East or the West. A saint currently revered is Hildegard von Bingen. She is more remembered today through recordings of her music and not in icons. Francis, on the other hand, is very popular in iconography. Thomas Aquinas, remembered for his writings and therefore a great influence on the Western Church, but not recorded so much in iconography. However, another Western saint very popular in icons is Julian of Norwich. Her cat usually gets a look in, but I chose to focus on her writings, and anyway, pens are easier to paint than cats. The most famous icon painter is Andrei Rublev. His icons are famous, but there are no known icons painted of him, even though he is hailed as a saint by the Eastern Church. This icon that I painted was modelled on a postage stamp published by Russia to commemorate Rublev's 600th anniversary. While it was not an event to disturb Eastern iconography, the Reformations, sparked by Martin Luther and followed up by others such as John Calvin, had huge ramifications for every part of the church life, particularly in the West, including liturgy and art. Another event, this time disruptive to the church in Russia, was the reign of Peter the Great. His embrace of Western culture brought the influence of Western art into iconography in Russia. During the communist era of 70 years, Leonid Ouspensky and others, working in exile in Paris, kept Russian iconography alive, pushing back against the influences brought by the 18th century and documenting their craft to help to a revival later in the 20th century back home in Russia. Coptic icon painters in Paris also pushed back against similar Western influence in the late 20th century, hence the modern style of Coptic icons. We don't see many icons of modern saints of the West, but a history of the Church could not ignore the influence of the Second Vatican Council on the liturgy, music and the art of the 20th century that has seen a revival of Orthodox iconography in Roman Catholic, Anglican and even in some Protestant churches. Many cathedrals and churches will feature very large icons of Christ Pantocrator and the Mother of God, Theotokos. Well, how does all this play out for we who paint icons, apart from being a terribly interesting bit of history? Well, here are a couple of things to consider. Our history tells us that the life of the church has been rocky. It's been punctuated by arguments and warfare, both verbal and armed. We have divided and reconciled and divided again. The art of the church has suffered along with this bumpy history. When we choose to paint in a certain style, we can remember that there will be faithful Christians in some other part of the church who will be outraged by the choices that we make. When we choose an icon as a model for painting, an icon that painting touches 2 points of history, so that we might ask, why did the artist choose to paint this saint? And what may have been going on in his or her church or society at the time? And also, and probably more importantly, what was happening in the church or the society of the saint that is being painted? And what did he or she do to prompt the church of the day, or on a later date, to decide that the church should remember that life as saintly before God? When we choose a saint to paint in an icon, we may ask if that saint was part of the Western or the Eastern Church. Furthermore, did the saint live before or after the Great Schism, when Rome and Constantinople separated? Embarking on this bit of research, I have realised something about the Celtic saints. These saints are increasingly popular among Orthodox Christians in Britain. While it is true that the Celtic churches were familiar in their day with Latin liturgy rather than Greek or Church Slavonic, nevertheless, the church had not made its final administrative division at this time. They date before the Great Schism. Well, So it is that church history can provide another layer of inquiry as we prepare our panels and our paints and dare to represent Christ, his mother and the saints for the prayerful reflection of faithful Christians.